Hey guys, you told me that the most popular price point for a new tent was under $200, so I went out to 7 of the top outdoor retailers and bought their #1 best-selling sub-$200 tent that was at least 4-person size or larger. And in this video, I'm going to take you through all of the tests that I did in order to score these tents on 7 different quality categories in order to find out which of these tents is actually the best. And I should also mention that this video is completely non-sponsored, which means you'll probably see some tents here that you've never seen on YouTube before. Now with that said, let's get to the tents. Our first contender is the Ozark Trail 10-person instant cabin. Its full retail price is $179.97, and I bought this particular tent from Walmart. The first thing to test is the ease and speed of setup. I did set up all of these tents multiple times, and upon the final setup, the Ozark Trail tent took 13 minutes and 33 seconds, which is quite fast for a tent of this size. And as far as the difficulty of the setup, I would say it's about moderate here. It is a bulky and fairly heavy tent, but the instant cabin style poles do help make assembly easier, and so overall, I'll give the setup process of the Ozark Trail tent a 6 out of 10. Next up is the Coleman Montana 8-person tent. This is another large tent, but don't worry if you like smaller tents, we have a few of those coming up later. The full retail price of the Montana is $169.97, and I bought this one from Bass Pro Shops. For those of you who don't know, Bass Pro Shops is also the owner of Cabela's, and so they tend to sell similar merchandise. And when it comes to the setup process, I actually found this Montana tent to be quite difficult to put up. It took 31 minutes and 27 seconds, which is over double what it took to set up the Ozark Trail tent, and in addition to that, it's just a fairly bulky tent like the Ozark Trail, but you don't really get the benefit of having those instant cabin poles because you get more analog poles here, and so overall I found it to be a hassle, and I'll give it a score of 3 out of 10. And here we have the Coleman Sundome 6. The Sundome is actually the #1 best-selling tent on Amazon.com, which is where I bought it, and the full retail price of this tent is $129.99, though I should mention that I'm using the full retail price for all of these tents, and in some cases you can actually get them for a better deal, which is actually what I did for many of these models. As for the setup process, the Sundome is fairly average. It took 15 minutes and 17 seconds to get this up, and it is less bulky than both of the tents we just covered, but at the same time the hardware is quite basic, and so overall there's some pros and cons here. I will say that those of you who are used to setting up a classic dome style tent like this one, you'll probably find the setup to be quite familiar, and taking all this together, I'll give the tent an overall score of 6 out of 10. Now let's look at the Kelty Discovery Basecamp 6. Its full retail price is $169.95, and I bought this tent from REI. This Kelty is a 6-person dome, very similar to the Coleman we saw just a moment ago, but it is a bit better when it comes to the speed and ease of setup. In particular, I think there's 2 main things that make the setup process easier here. It has pockets here in the corner for the poles rather than the pins that the Sundome have, and up at the top of the canopy where you fasten the body of the tent to the poles, you use clips here, which is a bit easier to manage than the sleeves on the top of the Coleman tent. I was able to set the Kelty Discovery up in just 12 minutes and 12 seconds, which is the fastest so far, and overall I'll give this tent a new high score of 7 out of 10. Next up we have the Kelty Rumpus 4. Its full retail price is $199.95, and I bought this from Moose Jaw. This is a smaller 4-person tent, which does make it a little bit easier to set up. However, it also has this nice extended vestibule, which does require a bit more effort to set up. It took me 13 minutes and 55 seconds to set this tent up. That is a bit more than the previous Kelty tent we saw. However, I did find the Rumpus to be a little bit easier to set up just because of the size of the tent, and so overall I'll give it a score of 7 out of 10. And here we have the Stoic Madrone 4. Its full retail price is $159.95, and I bought this from backcountry.com. And when it comes to the setup, this is also a small tent, and it has 2 small vestibules rather than the large extended vestibule that we saw with the Rumpus, which means we have 1 less pole required for setup here compared to the Rumpus, and so overall I would say it's a bit easier than that one to set up, and that is also reflected in the time. It's 11 minutes and 5 seconds, which is a new best time, so overall I'll give this a setup score of 7.5 out of 10. On to our 7th contender, the Mountainsmith Bear Creek 4-person tent. Its full retail price is $199.95, and I got this tent from LL Bean. And when it comes to the setup for the Mountainsmith tent, I would say it's essentially identical to the Stoic Madrone 4. This Mountainsmith tent took about 30 seconds less time than the Stoic Madrone, and it took a total of 10 minutes and 35 seconds to set up. However, this is a difference of less than 5%, and otherwise the setup process is about the same difficulty, and so I'm going to give them an identical score of 7.5 out of 10. Now let's look at the internal space of each tent, starting with the Ozark Trail one. The dimensions of this tent are 164 by 118 inches, which gives it a square footage of 134, which is 6 square feet less than the manufacturer's rating. And then if you really try to pack people in here and see the maximum number that you can get inside, it's about 10. However, if you really want to be comfortable inside this tent, it's really only going to be manageable with about 6 people, and with gear you're looking at 5 to 6. And then if you look at the stand height and the headroom in this tent, it's actually really good. I'm 5'10", and you can see there's plenty of headroom for me in here. It is 78 inches at its peak height, and the wall design is such that it allows lots of vertical space inside the tent, so you really can walk around inside here. So this is all good enough for a score of 9 out of 10. The Coleman Montana has dimensions of 190 by 84 inches, giving it a square footage of 111, and if you really pack it fully to its capacity, you could technically get 9 sleeping pads here on the inside, but you're really only going to be comfortable with 5 to 6 people, especially if you want to put any gear here on the inside. And if you look at the headroom here, it does have a pretty good peak height of 78 inches, but at 5'10", as soon as I take about 1 step away from the center of the tent, I start hitting my head on the mesh at the top because of these sloped sides. But overall, it's a pretty spacious tent, and I think it's good enough to get a score of 7.5. On to the Coleman Sun Dome. Now, the dimensions here are 120 by 118, which gives it a square footage of 98. And if you really pack things in here tight, you could technically get 7 spots in here for sleep capacity, but it's really only going to be comfortable with 4 or 5, especially if you want to put any gear on the inside. Now, if you look at the peak height of this tent, it gives you 72 inches at the peak height, which means at 5'10", I can stand up fully. But as you go to the sides of the tent, you quickly lose that headroom just because of the dome design. This is good enough for 6 out of 10 in my book. On to the Kelty Discovery Base Camp. Here the dimensions are 118 by 105, giving it a square footage of 86. And if you really pack it in tight, you can get 6 people in there, but it's only really going to be manageable for 3 to 4. And if you put gear on the inside, then I think the comfortable range is more like 2 to 3. Now the stand height here is interesting. It's 68, which is not quite tall enough for me to stand up in fully, but the headroom is still decent, and so I think it's good enough for a score of 5 out of 10. The Kelty Rumpus 4 is much smaller with dimensions of 96 by 88, which gives it a square footage of 59, and if you pack things in as tight as possible, you could fit 5 people, but really only 3 will be manageable, and I think 2 would actually be comfortable, especially when you start putting gear there on the inside. Now when it comes to the stand height of this tent, you get 58 inches, and that's not a ton. I definitely can't stand up straight in here, and you can see that there's a lot of slope to the walls too, so there's just not a lot of headroom. I give this a score of 3 out of 10. The Stoke Madrone 4 is also a pretty small tent with dimensions of 101 by 89 for a square footage of 62, and the maximum capacity of this tent is 5, but 3 is really going to be manageable, and 2 would be comfortable. Now, if you put gear on the inside of this tent, then I think 2 or 3 is possible. And then if you look at the peak height of this tent, it is 54 inches, which means again here you can't fully stand up on the inside and the headroom is not that great. And so overall I think this is good enough for a score of 3 out of 10. The Mountain Smith is a slightly larger small tent with dimensions of 105 by 92 for a square footage of 67 on the ground. The maximum capacity here is again 5, and I would say it is actually pretty manageable with 3 people, even with gear, but if you really want to be comfy, you could take that down to 2 for some extra space. The stand height here, or the maximum height I should say, is 55 inches, which again doesn't allow you to stand up fully, and it is that slope dome style, so you don't get a lot of headroom. This is good enough for a score of 3.5. Now let's get into the critically important test of waterproofing. Yes, I did test all of these tents in 2 days with light to moderate rain, and let's start here with this Ozark Trail tent. Now, I first just looked around the tent and examined whether or not it had leaked, and good news for the Ozark Trail tent, it did not appear to have leaked at all during the rainy days, and the next thing I did was to analyze for weaknesses that might pop up in worse weather or heavier rain. The first thing that I found there was this floor seam. So this seam is not a bathtub floor, and it also is not seam taped, and I can't really tell just by looking at it if it's seam sealed, but I'm guessing on a budget tent like this, it's not, which would be a weakness. Another thing is the roof rain fly. There's not a lot of coverage there, and with the right angle of wind, I could easily imagine some rain getting through that mesh and into the tent. The next thing is the window zippers. They are not seam taped, and that could be another place where rain comes through over time, especially heavier rains. And seam taping, mentioning seam taping, there's also a lot of places where it's just not applied very well, so I could imagine that actually flaking off later in the future and causing problems. And so overall, I say this tent is good enough for a score of 3 out of 10. Now let's move on to the Coleman Montana. So this tent is actually pretty interesting to me personally because it did not leak in my examination and testing here for this video. Now that's noteworthy because I have tested actually 4 Coleman tents now, and this is the first one to actually not leak on me. So let's look at the weaknesses though still. So if you look at the inside of the tent, it does have a bathtub floor, which is often a good thing, but the seam immediately above the bathtub floor is not taped. It could be seam sealed, but that's something to keep in mind. And then over the side windows here, the rainfly doesn't fully cover the zippers, so that could potentially be a weakness. And again, with the seam sealing here, there's just some sloppy work and some seams that could just flake off in the future, which could become a problem. But overall, this is not too bad, and I give it a score of 4 out of 10. Now here's where things get really interesting. So this is the Coleman Sundome, and yep, you guessed it, this tent did in fact leak during my testing, as you can see there, and it appears to have come straight through the door. And interestingly, the door is actually covered on the bottom half, but even despite this coverage, it did still leak through there somehow. Now, the other weaknesses this tent has is the coverage of the rain fly over the mesh paneling. With the right angle of wind or really bad storm, you could get a leak through there. And also, this little seam on the back window is not super well covered by the rain fly, and it's not seam taped on the inside. So that could potentially be a weakness. And then I also wanted to show this seam here, which appears to be the only seam on the inside of the body of the tent that is actually seam taped. Now, obviously, this tent is not a great performer, and I give it a score of 2 out of 10. Now onto the Kelty Discovery Base Camp. Now this tent is actually quite well waterproofed. If you look at the little inspection that I did here for the rain, you could tell that there were no leaks at all, and the zipper on the outside door is quite well covered, especially in comparison to the Coleman Sundome we talked about earlier. And then if you look at the inside of the tent door, it is also seam taped to further protect, but that seam tape does flake a bit, and so that could potentially come off in the future. If you look at the floor seam that goes around the edges of the tent, then it is seam taped as well. Maybe not as resilient as a bathtub floor, but still seems to be taped pretty well. This is a score of 7 out of 10. On to the Kelty Rumpus 4. Now, bad news for this tent, it actually was the very first one to leak after only about 2 hours of light to moderate rain. It didn't leak a lot, but it definitely did let some water through, and it appears to have come from this roof vent here. Now that's odd because it appears like these seams are taped. This one here isn't, but it is completely covered by a flap on the outside, so I'm not really sure where the leak came from. Now if we look at the rainfly vestibule here, these seams on either side of the zipper are not seam taped. They might be seam sealed, but I can't really tell exactly here. But that's worth mentioning. However, even if that did leak, it's so far away from the body of the tent, it's probably not an issue. And so overall, this seems to be a fairly well waterproof tent, other than, of course, the source of the leak. It's just a 2 out of 10. Now, these next two tents did really well in the rain. This one is the Stoic Madrone 4, and in the inspection of this tent, it didn't have a single drop of rain on the inside. And if you look at the rain fly of this tent, it's made out of a 75D polyester, and that's the same material that's used in much more premium tents, and it's the only one here that has it. I should point out that the zipper has a seam next to it that is not seam taped on the inside. It didn't cause any problems for me during testing, but if that's not seam sealed, it could be an issue for you or in the future. I also want to point out that some of the corner seam taping was flaking a little bit, so that could become a problem, but otherwise, this is a very well waterproof tent, and I give it a score of 8 out of 10. On to the Mountainsmith. Now, this tent is similar to the Stoic, but also different in some important ways. So first of all, it also didn't leak, which is great, but if you look at the floor material here has a 5,000 millimeter polyurethane coating compared to the 3,000 on the Stoic, which means this has a thicker waterproofing layer than the Stoic. If you go to the Rainfly and you look at that same PU coating, on the Rainfly it's actually higher at 3,000 millimeters on the Stoic compared to the 2,000 millimeters on this tent. Now if we look at the weaknesses of this tent, there's not a lot. It also has some flaking on the corner seam taping, and if you look at the Rainfly itself, actually here we have all of the seams taped, whereas in the Stoic we had that one missing. And so overall this is a very well waterproof tent, and I'll give it a score of 8 out of 10. And as a quick side note, some of you have actually asked me in the past if there's anything you can do to support the channel, and there's actually this new YouTube feature here called Super Thanks that I now have access to, and you can do $5, $10, and so on down the list through here, buy and send, and then you can do all of your details and everything straight through YouTube. So thanks to everyone who has asked about this, and thanks in advance to anyone who decides to support the channel in this way. For the next test, I wanted to evaluate the wind resistance of each tent, and I can't control the wind, but what I can control is this leaf blower, and it peaks out at about 60 miles per hour when about an inch away from this meter. Now I should emphasize that this is not the same as a 60 mile per hour wind, because that would of course be a much larger wall of wind, and it's just a different situation. And so I primarily use this just to evaluate weaknesses in the tents, and I've also considered the shape of each tent in giving these scores. So let's start with the Ozark Trail tent. It is huge, catches a lot of wind, and I can't give it more than a score of 2 out of 10. The Coleman Montana is interesting because it is a large tent, but its modified dome design makes it wick wind more effectively than that Ozark Trail does. However, it's still more susceptible to the wind when compared to something like the Coleman Sundome or the much smaller Stoic Madrone, so overall I give this a score of 3.5 out of 10. The Coleman Sundome actually surprised me with how sturdy it seemed in my little wind test, because I previously tested the Coleman Sky Dome and it actually broke in the high winds, and so when I set this Sundome up, it actually seemed sturdier and like it had thicker poles. Now the rating of the poles is actually the same between the two tents, and unfortunately I don't have the Sky Dome anymore to compare the two directly. However, I thought this was worth mentioning, and I can only evaluate the Sundome based on this testing that I've done here, so I'll give it a score of 6 out of 10. The Kelty Discovery Base Camp actually is slightly smaller than and also has thicker poles than the Coleman Sundome, so because of that you would think that it would be sturdier in the wind. However, in my testing it seemed to actually flop around a little bit
bit more and be a little less sturdy than the Sundome, so I'll give it a score of 5 out of 10. The Kelty Rumpus 4 is both smaller than and has more guy line loops compared to the Kelty Discovery U base camp, and so it has pretty solid wind resistance. However, the main point of weakness is that section in front of the main vestibule pole. There are no additional cross poles there, and that does pick up a little bit of wind, but overall the wind resistance here seems pretty solid, and I'll give it a score of 7 out of 10. Now for the Stoic Madrone 4. All three of the 4-person tents I tested had very similar and pretty high wind resistance. I'd say the Stoic's Rainfly moved the least, despite having less guy lines than the other two. The Stoic does have an additional loop where you could add a stake and or guy line on each of the non-door sides. However, there are no additional stakes or cords provided, which is why I didn't use those loops during testing. This is good enough for a score of 8 out of 10. On to the Mountainsmith. Now this had a pretty sturdy base because it's a short and pretty heavily curved dome style tent, just like the Stoic Madrone was that we saw a moment ago. However, this one did seem to flop around in the wind a little bit more than the others, especially in the vestibule here on the side. But overall, it's still pretty solid, and I give it a score of 7 out of 10. Now let's look at ventilation, starting with the Ozark Trail tent. I like to look at the overall mesh coverage, and I'll just give a rough estimate of 35% mesh with this tent. I also like to look at the number of windows and particularly how many things can be opened with the Rainfly on. For this tent, there are 10 if you include the door windows and the floor vents, and it's pretty good overall. I'll give it a score of 6.5 out of 10. The Coleman Montana, for such a large tent, really doesn't have that good of ventilation, and so if you look at the overall mesh coverage with everything removed, I'd estimate that it's roughly 20% mesh, but then if you look at the things that open, it's really just the front door and the two pretty small side windows, so that's good enough for a score of just 3.5. The Coleman Sundome 6, on the other hand, actually has a bit more mesh coverage. I'd estimate roughly 40% mesh, but importantly, it also has a window both in the front and back of the tent that allow airflow through the tent with and without the Rainfly on, so that's good enough for a score of 5 out of 10. Kelty Discovery Base Camp in many ways is quite similar to the Sundome, but it does have a bit more mesh coverage. I would estimate roughly 65% mesh coverage with everything off. However, it doesn't have that back window that the Sundome has, so I would say that this Kelty tent is a little bit less well ventilated, and I'll give it a score of just 4.5 out of 10. The Kelty Rumpus is pretty interesting when it comes to ventilation, and I would say the body of the tent has about 80% mesh coverage, which is really good, and then if you look at the tent with the Rainfly on, you'll notice that that big vestibule does allow a lot of space for air to come in. However, it doesn't have a big door on the other side, but I still think that's good enough for a score of 5.5 out of 10. When it comes to the Stoic Madrone, it has some ups and downs when it comes to ventilation. I would say it only really has mesh coverage of around 35%, but importantly, it has 2 doors, and so that allows for some extra airflow, even with the Rainfly on, but it's not quite as good of ventilation as something like the Coleman Sundome or the Rumpus, in my opinion. I'll give it a score of 4.75. Now, when it comes to ventilation, the Mountainsmith tent is actually pretty interesting. It has a tremendous amount of mesh coverage at about 85% of the canopy, I'd estimate. However, if you put the Rainfly on, which is how a lot of people use their tent, it only gets airflow really from one main side. But overall, it is pretty good still, and I'll give it a respectable score of 5 out of 10. Next, we need to look at the build quality of each tent, starting with the Ozark Trail. So first of all, let's look at the materials. Here we have a 68D canopy Rainfly, and if you look at the floor, we have a polyethylene material, which is that crunchy plastic you get in some budget tents. And here we have the poles. Now, they're steel here, and it said that on top that it was fiberglass, but it all looks like steel from my perspective. Now, I also wanted to show these clicking mechanisms. This helps with setup, but could be a fault point later on. And these are the stakes. They're fine, nothing to write home about, but pretty good overall. And then let's also talk about the craftsmanship here. So the seam taping had some issues in several places, and also I wanted to show you these large seam holes. So this is in the stitching, and I thought this was worth pointing out because it looks like it's even stretching a little bit here, and so that's not a good sign for the longevity of this tent. Considering all this, I'll give the Ozark Trail tent a build quality score of just 3 out of 10. On to the Coleman Montana. On the official Coleman website, it says this is made out of a Polyguard material, but I suspect that it's actually made out of a 68 or 75D polyester for the body and Rainfly. The floor here is made out of polyethylene, and if you look at the poles of this tent, it's made out of fiberglass all around. The stakes of this tent are pretty thin and not particularly great, and if you talk about the craftsmanship, we actually covered that mostly in the weatherproofing section, and so we'll just go ahead and give this a score of 3.5. Next, we have the Coleman Sundome, and I was able to find the exact materials for this, and for the body and Rainfly of the tent, it is a 68D polyester material, and if you look at the floor of this tent, it is a polyethylene, which is pretty typical of these budget Coleman tents, and if you look at the poles this comes with, it's fiberglass here with 11 millimeters in diameter. And if we look at the stakes here are, I would say, thin to medium thickness, and overall it's okay. I also wanted to mention that for build quality, I also consider the structure and sturdiness of each tent, and the Coleman was good enough for an overall score of 4 out of 10. The Kelty Discovery has some similarities with the Coleman tents. It has a similar 68D polyester body and rainfly. However, it is better than the Coleman tents in some important ways. For example, the mesh of the Kelty on the left is just a lot thicker and better than the Coleman Montana mesh that you can see on the right. And also for the floor, we have polyester material here, which I think is a bit nicer than polyethylene. For the fiberglass poles, we're 13 millimeters here, which is a bit thicker than what we saw in the Sundome. And I would say these stakes here are also just a pretty basic budget stake. But the one main thing that's holding the Discovery back is actually some issues with the seam taping, especially around the door. So I'll give it a score of 5 out of 10. Next, we have the Kelty Rumpus 4, and here we have a 68D polyester for the canopy, rainfly, and floor. And also similar to the Kelty Discovery, we have no seam mesh, which is pretty nice. For the poles here, we have, for the main body of the tent, 2 9mm fiberglass poles, and then there's also an 11mm fiberglass pole for the vestibule. Here we have some upgraded stakes, which I actually quite like. They have a point on the end, and they also have some geometry to make them a bit more durable. And overall, this is a pretty well-built tent, and I'll give it a score of 5.5. Now we get to the really good stuff. This is the Stoic Madrone 4. The canopy here is a 75D polyester, and the rainfly and floor are both also 75D, but those both also have a 3000mm polyurethane or PU coating, which helps with waterproofing. The mesh of this tent is also no-seam, and it's a 40D no-seam to be precise. If you look at the poles, they are aluminum, which is great, and it's a 11mm aluminum pole here to be precise. If you look at the stakes, they're pretty good, better than the Coleman, probably not as good as the Rumpus, but overall I'll give it a score of 7 out of 10. The Mountain Smith Bear Creek is also pretty good. If you look at the canopy, rainfly, and floor, they all have a 68D polyester. However, the rainfly has a 2000mm PU coating, and the floor has a 5000mm PU coating, which again helps with waterproofing. If you look at the mesh, we again have no-seam mesh here, and it's pretty nice and tight. And if you look at the poles, we have a slightly thinner but still aluminum pole when compared to the Stoic. If you look at the stakes, I would say the stakes here are actually maybe the worst, but overall the build quality is pretty good, and it's good enough for a score of 6 out of 10. On to our final category, the features category, and for this I like to look at the storage doors and any special features that are included. Starting with the Ozark Trail Tent, what we have here is a big storage pocket on the back wall. This is kind of in lieu of storage pockets around the bottom edges of the tent. You also get this media center pocket that hangs on one wall that you could put like a tablet or something in, and then there's a lot of hooks along the top of the tent that you can hang things from. Looking at the door, what we have here are 2 doors right on the front, and I did find the zipper to be a little difficult to use, especially with one hand. There is an internal room divider included with this tent, which is a nice feature, and you also get this polyethylene doormat. Overall, I think this is good enough for a score of 5 out of 10. The storage on the Coleman Montana is pretty sparse. You just get 2 small pockets and then 1 hook at the peak of the tent, and then if you look at the door, it has this swinging door feature, and I found it to be kind of gimmicky and a bit annoying to use personally. It does have a awning here, which is kind of nice. You can put camp chairs under there and be a little bit protected from the sun and rain, and it does have a polyethylene doormat. Overall, I give this a score of 4 out of 10. The features on the Coleman Sundome are fairly sparse. It just has 2 small storage pockets and then 1 hook at the top of the tent. However, I must say that I really do like the door on this tent. The zipper is really smooth and easy to use. It would, of course, get a higher score if it had multiple doors. Here we just have 1, but that's okay. And then you also get a polyurethane doormat. Overall, this is good enough for a score of 4 out of 10. The storage on the Kelty Discovery Base Camp is actually much better. There are a total of 5 storage pockets on the inside. 3 of them are large, 2 of them are small. And if you look at the top of the tent, you get 1 mage storage hook at the top, and then in each of the 4 corners, you get an additional cloth loop. And then if you look at the door, I really don't like the door here. It gets snagged a lot on the seam taping and on the covers. It is covered really well, which helps with waterproofing. However, from a usability standpoint, it just gets snagged too much, and I found it irritating. And so overall, I give this a score of 4 out of 10. The Kelty Rumpus 4 is one of the most interesting tents when it comes to the features, and let's start with the storage. So first of all, it just has 4 small storage pockets, and then it has 5 fabric loops at the top of the tent, 1 at the peak and 1 in each corner. And then if you look at the doors, there's the body of the tent door and also the vestibule door. Both of them are fairly easy to use, so no problems there, but really the main attraction of this tent is the extended vestibule. I would go so far as to say this extended vestibule is the best one that I've used right after the North Face Wawona. And so this is a really cool space where you can have some extra outdoor storage space, or you can set up a couple camp chairs and have some area where you're protected from a light rain or perhaps some sunshine. And it's just a really great feature that you don't get with a lot of tents. Overall, I'd say the Rumpus is good enough for a score of 6 out of 10. The Stoic Madrone 4 is another well-featured tent. It has 2 large storage pockets, but they each have dividers down the middle, which makes it more equivalent to having 4 small storage pockets. And then if you look at the top of the tent, it actually comes with an included mesh shelf that you can hang off of the loops at the top of the tent, giving you another storage option. The Stoic also provides 2 vestibule spaces, which gives you some extra outdoor storage space. It also gets an edge because it's the only tent in this video that has a door on more than one side of this tent, which of course is a really nice feature when you have multiple people inside. I also found the door and zippers to be quite easy to use. There was one thing about the zipper that I wanted to mention, and that is that it has 2 zippers on the rainfly vestibule portion, and that was a little bit odd to me, and I did accidentally a few times grab both zippers, which doesn't fully unzip the rainfly, so that's something to keep in mind. But the Stoic is definitely the best featured tent we've seen so far, and I'll give it a score of 7 out of 10. Now we're on to the Mountainsmith. Here we have 2 large storage pockets on the inside. They're both on the door side of the tent, and one of them's divided in the middle, so maybe call it 3 storage pockets total. It does also have a fabric loop at the peak of the tent that you could use for hanging something off of. Similar to the Stoic, we also have 2 vestibules here that can be used for storage. However, the one on the back wall of the tent doesn't have a door that you can come in and out of. You can put stuff out through this little port, but you can't actually exit the tent through that door and then through the rainfly because there's not a zipper on the rainfly. The Mountainsmith door is also nice, and in fact it's the only tent in this video that has YKK brand zippers. A footprint is also included with this tent, and overall I would say it's pretty well featured, and I'll give it a score of 6 out of 10.
And if you average the scores from each of these categories in order to give an overall score to each of these tents, then the leaderboard looks like that. Yes, that's right, the Stoic Madrone 4 comes out on top, and I do think it's safe to say that that's the king of budget tents. However, if it's not the one for you, then I think the Kelty Discovery Basecamp 6 is also a good option. And for some people who really like to be able to walk around and have lots of headroom, the Ozark Trail tent is also one to consider. It does have some quality concerns like we covered earlier, but that could work well for some people. Now, I'm also going to suggest that you go and watch this playlist here. That's where I put all of my tent review videos, and I'm going to be doing individual reviews of each of these tents, and you'll find them there. So go check that out, and I'll see you next time. Thanks for watching.